The metal chair felt cold against Maya Rodriguez's back as she sat in the center of the massive crystal chamber. The walls stretched up so high that she could barely see the ceiling. Lights floated in the air around her, casting strange shadows that moved on their own. She had seen many alien places in her 43 years of military service, but this place still amazed her. 12 different alien beings sat in a half-circle around her. Each one looked completely different from the others. Some had blue skin that glowed softly in the dim light. Others had scales that changed colors when they moved. A few looked almost like giant insects with too many arms and eyes that never blinked. Maya had learned not to judge aliens by how they looked. Some of the strangest-looking ones had been her best allies in past wars. Small metal devices floated near each alien's head. These were translators that turned their words into English for Maya to understand. They also changed her words into whatever language each alien spoke. The technology was impressive, but Maya had always preferred learning languages the old way. It helped her understand how different species thought. At the center of the half-circle sat the leader of this tribunal. His name was Vextai, and he belonged to a species called the Ethereals. He was tall and thin, with blue skin that seemed to glow from inside. His large black eyes never seemed to blink as they watched Maya. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly through the chamber. Captain Maya Rodriguez of the human species, Vextai began. You stand before the Galactic Federation Council today so we can decide if your species should join our alliance. We have studied your people for many years. We have watched your expansion across the stars. We have seen your wars and your peace treaties. Today, we will ask you questions about humanity's nature. Maya nodded but said nothing. She had been briefed about this meeting by Earth's diplomatic team. They had told her to be honest but careful. The Federation had never allowed a species like humanity to join before. Most of the species in the Federation had evolved past violence millions of years ago. They solved problems with talking and meditation. They shared resources freely and never fought wars. Humanity was different. Humans still fought. They still killed when they had to. They still believed that sometimes violence was the only way to protect innocent people. This made many Federation species nervous. Some thought humans were too dangerous to be trusted. Others thought humans might be useful allies if the galaxy ever faced a real threat. A being with gray skin and 4 arms raised one hand to speak. Maya recognized her from the briefing files. This was Counselor Kethare from the Peaceful Reach, a group of star systems where no weapon had been fired in over 1,000 years. Her species had developed powerful telepathic abilities that let them solve conflicts before they started. Captain Rodriguez, Kethare said in a voice that sounded like singing. Our records show that humanity has been involved in 17 major military conflicts in just the past 50 years. Your species seems to find war wherever it goes. How do you explain this pattern of violence? Maya had expected this question. She took a deep breath and looked at each council member before answering. Counselor Kethare, we don't look for war. War finds us. In every conflict you mentioned, humans were either defending themselves or protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. We would prefer to solve problems peacefully, but sometimes that's not possible. Another council member spoke up. This one had green skin covered in scales and spoke with a hissing sound. But Captain, your species has developed such advanced weapons. Your military technology is centuries ahead of your civilian technology. This suggests a species that values war over peace. Maya shook her head. We develop weapons because we've learned that peaceful species need protectors. Look at your own history, Counselor. Your species was once enslaved by the Drakari Empire. It was human forces that helped liberate your worlds during the Freedom Wars. We develop weapons so others can live in peace. The chamber fell quiet for a moment. Maya could see some of the council members whispering to each other through their translator devices. She knew that her words made them uncomfortable. Most Federation species tried not to think about the violent parts of their past. They preferred to focus on their current peaceful existence. Vextai raised one long, thin hand for silence. Captain Rodriguez, we appreciate your perspective on these matters. However, we must address more specific concerns about human military behavior. Our investigation has revealed that individual humans often accumulate what you call combat records that would be considered impossible by Federation standards. Maya felt her stomach tighten. She knew where this was heading. The Federation had clearly done their homework about human military history. They had probably studied the records of many human soldiers and officers. They would have found numbers that seemed impossible to their peaceful minds. We understand that you personally have extensive combat experience, Vextai continued. Your service record spans 4 decades and includes participation in most major human military operations during that time. Is this correct? Yes, sir, Maya replied. I've served in the Human Defense Forces for 43 years. I've held various ranks and positions during that time. A new voice spoke from the left side of the half-circle. Maya turned to see a being that looked almost like a living tree, with bark-like skin and leaves growing from its arms. This was Counselor Grovewind from the Harmony Collective, a species that had never known violence at all. They reproduced by sharing genetic material peacefully and made all decisions through group meditation. Captain Rodriguez, Grovewind said in a voice that sounded like wind through branches. We find it difficult to understand how a single being can be involved in so much conflict. In our society, if one individual were present at even one violent incident, they would receive immediate counseling and healing. How does your species cope with individuals who experience repeated exposure to violence? Maya thought carefully about her answer. These beings truly didn't understand what war meant. They had never faced an enemy that wanted to destroy them completely. They had never had to choose between killing and watching innocent people die. Counselor Grovewind, she said slowly, humans cope with war by remembering why we fight. We fight to protect people who can't protect themselves. We fight to preserve the freedom to choose peace. We fight so that others don't have to fight. The chamber was silent again. Maya could feel the weight of their stares. She knew that her words sounded strange to them. How could violence preserve peace? How could killing protect life? These were questions that humans had wrestled with for thousands of years. Maya had wrestled with them herself through 4 decades of military service. Vextai looked down at a glowing tablet in front of him. Captain Rodriguez, before we continue, we must ask you a direct question about your personal involvement in these conflicts. Our records suggest that your individual combat record is extensive. We need you to be completely honest with us about the scope of your military actions. Maya knew what was coming next. The question that would define this entire tribunal. The question that would determine whether humanity was welcomed into the galactic community or marked as a threat to be contained. She straightened her shoulders and prepared to tell the truth, no matter how much it might shock these peaceful beings. The silence in the chamber stretched on like a held breath. Maya could hear the soft humming of the translator devices and the gentle whoosh of the air recycling systems. 12 pairs of alien eyes watched her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Some looked curious. Others seemed afraid. A few appeared disgusted, as if they were looking at something that shouldn't exist. Counselor Zaraneth leaned forward in her seat. She belonged to the Harmony Collective, the same species as Grovewind. Her people had evolved beyond physical conflict so long ago that they had no words in their language for violence. They had to use borrowed terms from other species when they talked about war. To them, the very concept of one living being intentionally harming another was like a nightmare that couldn't be real. Captain Rodriguez, Zaraneth said, her voice carrying a note of something Maya recognized as revulsion. We have studied your species' military records with great care. We have tried to understand how beings who claim to value life can engage in such destructive behavior. Maya remained quiet. She had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to let others finish speaking before responding. In negotiations, the person who spoke first often revealed more than they intended. Zaraneth continued, her tree-like features shifting as she spoke. What troubles us most is not just the scale of human conflicts, but the personal involvement of individual humans. In our society, if violence occurred, it would be a tragedy that affected our entire species. We would mourn for generations. But humans seem to specialize in violence. Some humans appear to have dedicated their entire lives to it. The other council members nodded or made their species-equivalent gestures of agreement. Maya could see that this was something they had discussed before she arrived. They had clearly spent time trying to understand how a species could produce individuals whose lives revolved around warfare. We have identified several humans whose military records seem impossible to us, Zaraneth went on. Individuals who claim to have been personally responsible for the deaths of hundreds or even thousands of other beings. This level of violence by a single individual is something our species cannot comprehend. Maya felt her jaw tighten slightly. She could guess where this was heading. The Federation had obviously done deep research into human military history. They would have found the records of famous soldiers, marines, pilots, and officers. They would have seen numbers that seemed impossible to species that had never fought a real war. Counselor Thekmore spoke up from the right side of the circle. His species, the Imperium, was one of the few in the Federation that still understood military concepts. They had ritual combat and formal duels, but nothing like human warfare. Their conflicts were individual contests with strict rules and honor codes. Captain Rodriguez, Thekmore said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. My people engage in combat, but it is always honorable single combat between willing participants. We cannot understand how humans can claim individual responsibility for such massive loss of life. In our culture, a warrior who killed even 10 opponents in his lifetime would be considered legendary. Yet human military records speak of much larger numbers. Maya nodded slowly. Counselor Thekmore, human warfare is different from Imperium ritual combat. When we fight for survival. We fight to protect entire populations of civilians. We use whatever tools and tactics are necessary to win quickly and save lives on both sides. But the numbers, insisted Counselor Vextai. Our analysis suggests that some human military personnel have combat records that span decades and involve direct responsibility for thousands of casualties. How is such a thing possible without your species becoming completely consumed by violence? Maya took a deep breath. She had known this moment would come. During her briefing on Earth, the diplomatic team had warned her that the Federation would focus on individual combat records. They had prepared her for questions about human military effectiveness and the psychological impact of warfare on human soldiers. What they hadn't prepared her for was how alienating it would feel to explain human nature to beings who had never faced a real enemy. These species had been lucky. They had evolved in parts of the galaxy where they faced no existential threats. They had never encountered enemies who wanted to destroy them completely. They had never been forced to choose between violence and extinction. Council members, Maya said carefully, I think you're asking me about my personal military record. Zaranetha's leaves rustled with what Maya had learned was a sign of distress in her species. Yes, Captain Rodriguez. Our records indicate that you have been involved in numerous conflicts throughout your career. We need to understand the extent of your personal participation in violence. Maya looked around the circle of faces. She could see fear in some of their expressions. They were afraid of her, she realized. Not because she was threatening them now, but because her very existence challenged their understanding of how intelligent beings should behave. How many? Zaraneth asked quietly. How many lives have you personally taken in the name of your species' conflicts? The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Maya felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. She had known this question would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that preparation couldn't match. She thought about the honest answer. 43 years of military service. 17 major campaigns. Dozens of smaller operations. Sniper work in her early years. Artillery strikes during the middle period of her career. Orbital bombardments authorized when she reached command rank. The numbers were precise in her military records, but they felt abstract when she tried to think about them as individual lives. Maya had stopped counting years ago. Not because she didn't care, but because the numbers had become too large to process emotionally. Each death had been necessary at the time. Each kill had been to protect someone else or to accomplish a mission that would save more lives than it cost. But the total number had grown beyond what her mind could handle. I stopped counting, she said finally, her voice quiet but clear in the vast chamber. "Stop counting." Thekmor rumbled. "When? After how many?" Maya met his eyes directly. She could see shock there, and something that might have been admiration mixed with horror. She had seen that look before, from junior officers who were just learning what war really meant. "I stopped counting at 10,000. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several council members physically recoiled in their seats. Zaraneth made a sound like branches breaking in a storm. Two of the insectoid representatives began rapidly clicking and chittering to each other. Even Thekmor, whose species understood combat, looked stunned. The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as council members turned to their aides and advisors. Maya could see the translators working overtime, turning her words into dozens of different languages. The number 10,000 seemed to echo in the air around her. Maya sat perfectly still in her metal chair, watching the chaos her words had caused. She felt tired suddenly, in a way that had nothing to do with the long journey to reach the station. It was the tiredness that came from carrying the weight of necessary choices for too many years. She had known that the truth would shock them. But she also knew that lying would be worse. These beings needed to understand what humanity was capable of, both the terrible and the necessary parts. They needed to know that humans were willing to carry the burden of violence so that others could remain innocent. Vextai raised his hand for silence, but it took several minutes for the chamber to quiet down. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something Maya couldn't identify. Fear? Respect? Disgust? "Captain Rodriguez," he said slowly, "perhaps you should explain to us how such a number is possible." Maya looked at the faces around her and saw the same expression she had seen many times before. It was the look people got when they first learned what war really meant. Not the clean, simple version shown in entertainment programs, but the messy, complicated reality of life and death decisions made by ordinary people in impossible situations. "I can see that my answer has upset you," Maya said calmly. "Let me explain how someone like me comes to exist. Let me tell you about my first war." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The memories were old now, but they still felt fresh when she let herself remember them clearly. "I was 19 years old when I first killed another human being. It was during what we call the corporate wars." Counselor Kethare tilted her head in confusion. "Corporate wars? We do not understand this term. In our society, economic organizations exist to provide for the common good. How can they wage war?" Maya had expected this question. The Federation species had long ago evolved past the concept of competing for resources. They shared everything freely and made decisions through consensus. The idea that groups might fight over profit or market control was alien to them. On Earth and in the early human colonies, Maya explained, powerful companies sometimes used private armies to take control of valuable resources. They would attack colonies, overthrow local governments, and enslave populations to work in their mines and factories. The chamber was quiet as the council members processed this information. Maya could see shock and disgust on many faces. To these peaceful species, the idea of using violence for economic gain was nearly incomprehensible. "I was a Marine stationed on New California, a farming colony about 40 light years from Earth," Maya continued. "The colony was peaceful. Families had been living there for 3 generations, growing food and raising children. They had no military beyond a small security force to deal with wild animals and natural disasters." Maya's voice took on a distant quality as she remembered. The Titan Corporation wanted the mineral rights under the colony's farmland. The colonists refused to sell. So Titan hired a private army and came to take what they wanted by force. Vextai leaned forward slightly. "And your forces were there to protect the colonists?" "My unit was there for training exercises," Maya said. "We were supposed to practice operating in agricultural environments. We had about 200 Marines against Titan's 3,000 mercenaries. When their ships appeared in orbit, we had a choice. We could evacuate and let the corporation take the colony, or we could fight. The logical choice would be evacuation," Grove Wind said, his bark-like skin shifting colors. 200 against 3,000 cannot succeed. Your survival and the colonists' survival would be better served by retreat. Maya smiled sadly. Counselor Grovewind, that's exactly what Titan Corporation was counting on. They knew that any reasonable military force would look at those odds and withdraw. They expected us to abandon the colonists and let them take over without a fight. But you did not withdraw, Feckmore observed. His warrior culture could appreciate the courage involved, even if the tactics were foreign to him. We did not, Maya confirmed. Our commanding officer was Staff Sergeant Carlos Hernandez. He had been a Marine for 20 years, and he had seen what corporations did to defenseless colonists. He gathered us together and explained our options. Maya paused, remembering that day clearly. She could still see Carlos standing in front of the assembled Marines, his weathered face serious but calm. He had explained the situation without emotion, laying out the odds and the likely consequences of both choices. Sergeant Hernandez told us that we could follow regulations and evacuate. No one would blame us. The odds were impossible, and we had no obligation to protect the colony. But he also told us what would happen to the colonists if we left. What would happen? Zaraneth asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Titan Corporation would force them to work in the mines they planned to build. Anyone who resisted would be killed as an example to the others. Children would be separated from their parents and raised as corporate property. Within a generation, there would be no free colonists left on New California. The council members exchanged glances. Maya could see that they were struggling to understand how beings could treat each other this way. In their societies, such behavior was literally unthinkable. So we voted, Maya continued. Carlos gave every Marine a choice. We could leave on the next transport, or we could stay and fight. There would be no shame in leaving. But if we stayed, we would probably die. How many chose to stay? Vextai asked quietly. All of us, Maya said simply. Every single Marine voted to stay and fight. Maya let that sink in for a moment before continuing. The siege lasted 3 months. Titan's mercenaries surrounded the colony and tried to starve us out. They controlled the sky, so we couldn't get supplies or reinforcements. We had to make every shot count, every resource last as long as possible. She began to describe the tactics they had used. How they had turned the colonists' farming equipment into improvised weapons. How they had used the colonists' knowledge of the local terrain to set ambushes and disappear before the enemy could respond. How they had made the mercenaries pay dearly for every meter of ground. I was assigned to Firebase Delta, one of the outer defensive positions, Maya said. My job was to use a sniper rifle to eliminate high-value targets. Enemy officers, heavy weapons specialists, communications personnel. Anyone whose death would disrupt their operations. Counselor Kethare looked uncomfortable. You targeted specific individuals for death? Yes, Maya said without hesitation. In war, some targets are more valuable than others. A single enemy commander might be coordinating the actions of hundreds of soldiers. Killing that one person could save dozens of your own people's lives. How many did you kill during the siege? Feckmore asked. Maya thought back to those 3 months. She had kept careful count in those days, marking each confirmed kill in a notebook. It had seemed important then to know exactly how many lives she had taken in defense of the colony. During the siege of New California, I confirmed 87 kills, she said. Most were with a sniper rifle, but some were with explosives or close combat weapons when the enemy got too close to our positions. The number seemed to hang in the air. To the council members, 87 deaths by one person's hand was an enormous tragedy. To Maya, it was just the beginning of a long career in service to humanity's survival. What happened to the colony? Grovewind asked. We held out long enough for Earth's main fleet to arrive, Maya said. When Titan Corporation saw our battleships dropping out of hyperspace, they decided the colony wasn't worth a fight with Earth's military. They withdrew their forces and abandoned their claim. So you succeeded, Vextai observed. We saved the colony, Maya agreed. But we lost 130 Marines doing it. Good people who died because a corporation wanted to make more money. Carlos Hernandez was one of them. He died defending the main gate during their final assault. Maya looked around the circle of alien faces. That was my first war, council members. I was 19 years old, and I learned that sometimes killing is the only way to protect innocent people. I learned that someone has to be willing to do terrible things to prevent even more terrible things from happening. And this pattern continued throughout your career? Zaraneth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. This pattern continued, Maya confirmed. Each war taught me new lessons about the cost of protecting others. Each conflict added to the total number of lives I had to take in service of the greater good. The chamber was quiet as the council members considered her words. Maya could see that they were beginning to understand, though the understanding clearly disturbed them. She was not a monster who enjoyed killing. She was a guardian who had accepted the burden of necessary violence so that others could live in peace. But she could also see that they were not ready for the full scope of what that burden had meant over 4 decades of service. Maya watched the council members whisper among themselves, their translator devices working overtime to convert their discussions into multiple languages. She could see that her story about New California had disturbed them, but she also sensed they were beginning to understand why humans developed soldiers like her. What they weren't prepared for was learning about humanity's encounter with truly alien evil. Council members, Maya said, raising her voice slightly to get their attention. The corporate wars were just the beginning of my education in violence. They taught me that humans sometimes fight each other for terrible reasons. But my real education began when we encountered something that wasn't human at all. Vextai settled back in his seat, his blue skin flickering with patterns that Maya had learned indicated deep attention among his people. You speak of the Devourer Swarm. We have read reports of this conflict, but we admit we find them difficult to believe. Maya nodded grimly. I understand your skepticism. Even humans who lived through the Swarm War sometimes have trouble believing what happened. The Devourers were unlike anything any of us had imagined possible. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The Swarm War was harder to talk about than the corporate wars. Fighting other humans, even corrupt mercenaries, was something the Council could understand. Fighting an enemy that existed only to consume and reproduce was something else entirely. I was a lieutenant colonel by then, with 15 years of experience in various conflicts, Maya began. I thought I understood war. I had fought pirates, separatists, corporate armies, and rogue military units. I believed I had seen the worst that intelligent beings could do to each other. Counselor Zaraneth leaned forward, her tree-like features showing what Maya recognized as concern. The reports speak of a species that consumed entire worlds. Surely this is an exaggeration. It is not an exaggeration, Maya said flatly. The Devourers were an insectoid species that had evolved to consume all organic matter on a planet, reproduce rapidly using that biomass, and then move on to the next world. They had no art, no culture, no technology beyond what they needed for traveling between stars and breaking down living tissue. Maya could see disbelief on several faces. These peaceful species had trouble accepting that such creatures could exist. In their experience, intelligence always led to cooperation and the development of peaceful societies. The first sign we had of them was when the colony of Shepherd's Moon went silent, Maya continued. We sent a survey ship to investigate. What they found was a dead world. Every plant, every animal, every microorganism had been consumed. The planet's surface looked like it had been scraped clean by some enormous machine. But surely there were survivors? Grovewind asked. Some beings must have escaped. Maya shook her head slowly. There were no survivors on Shepherd's Moon. We found evidence that the colonists had tried to fight back, but their weapons had been useless. The Devourers had overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. 300,000 people had lived on that world. When we arrived, we found only empty buildings and bare rock. The chamber fell silent as the council members processed this information. Maya could see horror and disbelief warring on their faces. The idea of an entire world's population being consumed was beyond their experience. Over the next 6 months, we lost 4 more colonies, Maya said. Each time, the pattern was the same. The devourers would arrive in massive hive ships, swarm over the planet's surface, and consume everything living. Then they would load the biomass into their ships and move on. Thekmore's rumbling voice broke the silence. How did you fight such an enemy? Our records suggest that conventional warfare was ineffective against them. Conventional warfare was almost useless, Maya agreed. The devourers didn't care about territory or strategic objectives. They couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. They existed only to feed and reproduce. Killing a few thousand of them meant nothing when they could replace those losses in days. Maya remembered the first battles clearly. Human military doctrine had been built around fighting other humans who wanted to win and survive. The devourers didn't care about winning or surviving as individuals. They only cared about feeding the hive. The turning point came at Kepler Station, Maya said. It was a major research facility with a population of 800,000 civilians and researchers. When our scouts detected a devourer fleet heading for Kepler, humanity decided to make a stand. She described the preparations for the battle. How they had evacuated non-essential personnel and prepared the station's defenses. How they had positioned the fleet to protect the civilian transports. How they had known from the beginning that many of them would not survive. The devourer fleet that attacked Kepler was the largest we had ever seen, Maya said. 300 hive ships, each one carrying millions of individual devourers. Our entire fleet had only 50 ships and 200,000 personnel. The odds were impossible, Vextai observed. The odds were impossible, Maya agreed. But we had learned something important about the devourers. They were individually weak and had no real intelligence beyond their basic instincts. They could be destroyed if you were willing to get close enough and sacrifice everything to do it. Maya began to describe the battle in detail. How human ships had rammed devourer hive vessels, using their crews' lives to destroy enemy breeding centers. How boarding parties had fought their way into enemy ships to plant nuclear charges, knowing they would never escape alive. My job was to lead boarding actions against the hive ships, Maya said. We would blast holes in their hulls and fight our way inside with flamethrowers and explosive charges. The goal was to reach their breeding chambers and destroy as many eggs as possible before the devourers overwhelmed us. She could see revulsion on several faces as she described the interior of a devourer hive ship. The organic walls that pulsed like living tissue. The massive chambers filled with eggs and larvae. The adult devourers that swarmed like angry insects when their nests were threatened. On my first boarding action, I led a team of 20 Marines into a hive ship, Maya said. We fought for 6 hours through corridors filled with devourers. My team used flamethrowers to clear a path while I placed charges in the breeding chambers. How many of your team survived? Grovewind asked quietly. 3 of us made it back to our ship, Maya said simply. 17 good Marines died so we could destroy one breeding chamber containing approximately 50,000 devourer eggs. The mathematics of that exchange horrified the council members. Maya could see them struggling to understand how such losses could be considered acceptable. But those 17 deaths prevented 50,000 new devourers from being born, Maya explained. Each of those devourers would have consumed hundreds of pounds of organic matter during their lifetime. By destroying that breeding chamber, we saved entire ecosystems from being devoured. Maya described more boarding actions over the 8 months of the Kepler battle. How she had learned to navigate the alien environments of the hive ships. How she had developed new tactics for fighting in zero gravity against enemies that could crawl on any surface. How she had watched hundreds of good soldiers die to protect civilians they would never meet. The worst part was Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Maya said, her voice growing quiet. He was 22 years old, fresh out of the academy. During our assault on the primary hive ship, our demolition charges failed to detonate. We were trapped in the breeding chamber with thousands of devourers closing in. She paused, remembering Jake's young face behind his helmet visor. Jake had a backup charge in his equipment pack. But the only way to use it was to stay behind and detonate it manually. He volunteered without hesitation. He sacrificed himself. Zaranev asked. He saved a transport ship carrying 50,000 refugees, Maya said. Jake's sacrifice destroyed the Hive ship's command center and gave our fleet the opening they needed to break through the Devourer lines. Those 50,000 people are alive today because a 22-year-old Marine was willing to die for them. Maya looked around the circle of alien faces. During the Kepler battle, I personally led 37 boarding actions. I destroyed dozens of breeding chambers and killed thousands of individual devourers. But more importantly, I helped save 800,000 innocent lives from a fate worse than death. The chamber was silent as the council members absorbed this information. Maya could see that they were beginning to understand the scope of violence that sometimes became necessary. The Devourer War had taught humanity that some enemies could not be reasoned with or reformed. They could only be destroyed completely. The final count from Kepler was over 4,000 confirmed kills added to my record, Maya said. But every one of those kills prevented innocent people from being consumed by monsters. That's what you need to understand about human warfare, council members. We don't fight because we enjoy violence. We fight because sometimes violence is the only thing that stands between civilization and chaos. Councillor Theckmore shifted in his seat, his massive frame causing the metal chair to creak softly. Among all the council members, he was the only one whose species still understood combat, though their version was vastly different from human warfare. His people fought formal duels with ancient weapons, following honor codes that had been unchanged for thousands of years. Captain Rodriguez, Theckmore rumbled, his voice carrying a note of professional curiosity. Your description of the Devourer conflict is illuminating. But I must ask about human military methods. My people fight with honor, following established rules that ensure fairness and dignity even in combat. Your tactics seem to follow no such codes. Maya had expected this question. The Federation records would have shown them examples of human military tactics that seemed impossibly ruthless to species that fought according to strict honor codes. Councillor Theckmore, Maya said respectfully, human warfare is not about honor or fairness. It's about ending conflicts as quickly as possible with the least loss of life on both sides. When innocent people are dying, we use whatever methods are most effective. Theckmore leaned forward, his warrior instincts engaged despite his obvious discomfort with human methods. But surely there are rules? Limits to what civilized beings will do in combat. We have rules, Maya confirmed. We protect civilians when possible. We treat prisoners humanely. We don't use weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. But within those limits, we use every advantage we can find. She could see confusion on several faces. These species had evolved past the concept of total war. Their conflicts, when they occurred at all, were limited affairs with agreed-upon rules and objectives. They couldn't understand warfare as a tool for achieving political goals through any means necessary. Let me tell you about the Outer Rim Rebellion, Maya said. It will help you understand how humans approach asymmetric warfare. Maya paused to organize her thoughts. The Outer Rim campaign had been one of the most challenging of her career, requiring skills and tactics that conventional military training couldn't teach. 20 years ago, several human colonies on the edge of our territory declared independence from Earth's government, Maya began. They had been convinced to rebel by an arms dealer named Victor Kane, who promised them advanced alien weapons in exchange for exclusive mining rights. Vextai's blue skin flickered with interest. This was an internal human conflict? Yes, Maya confirmed. Kane had sold the rebel colonies weapons that were far superior to anything Earth's military possessed at the time. Plasma rifles, energy shields, gravity bombs. The rebels thought they could win a quick war and establish their own independent nation. Maya described the early stages of the rebellion. How the rebels had used their superior weapons to destroy several Earth patrol ships. How they had captured key mining facilities and declared their independence. How Earth's government had been forced to respond to prevent other colonies from following suit. The conventional approach would have been to gather a large fleet and attack the rebel strongholds directly, Maya said. But that would have resulted in massive casualties on both sides, including many civilians who had been forced to support the rebellion. So what did you do instead? Grovewind asked, his bark-like skin shifting colors with curiosity. I was sent behind enemy lines with a small team of specialists, Maya said. Our mission was to organize resistance among the civilian population and disrupt the rebels' ability to use their advanced weapons effectively. Maya could see shock on several faces. The idea of using civilians in warfare was alien to these peaceful species. In their societies, conflicts were settled by designated representatives while the general population remained safely uninvolved. You involved non-combatants in your military operations? Zaraneth asked, her voice carrying clear disapproval. The civilians were already involved, Maya explained. Kane's rebels were forcing them to work in the mines and factories that produced materials for the rebellion. Anyone who refused was imprisoned or killed. We gave them a way to fight back. Maya began to describe her 2 years behind enemy lines. How she had made contact with civilian resistance groups who opposed the rebellion. How she had taught farmers and miners to build improvised explosives from fertilizer and household chemicals. How she had organized sabotage operations that disrupted rebel supply lines. The key was to make the rebels' advanced weapons useless, Maya explained. A plasma rifle needs energy cells to function. Energy shields require maintenance computers. Gravity bombs need targeting systems. We taught the civilians how to sabotage these support systems. She described specific operations in detail. How they had poisoned the coolant in a rebel weapons factory, causing an explosion that destroyed 6 months of production. How they had reprogrammed the targeting computers on a rebel base, making their defensive systems attack their own ships. How they had convinced several rebel officers to defect by showing them evidence of Kane's real plans for the colonies. But these tactics involved deception, Feckmore protested. There is no honor in tricking an enemy. There is no honor in allowing innocent people to suffer while you follow outdated rules, Maya replied firmly. Honor codes are luxuries that only work when both sides agree to follow them. Kane's rebels had no honor. They were using civilians as human shields and executing anyone who opposed them. Maya continued her account of the rebellion. How she had led hit-and-run attacks against rebel supply convoys. How she had used the rebels' own propaganda against them by spreading rumors that Kane was planning to sell them into slavery after the war. How she had gradually turned the civilian population against their supposed liberators. The turning point came at Fort Liberty, Maya said. It was the rebels' main command center, protected by energy shields and automated defenses. A direct assault would have cost thousands of lives. She described the siege in detail. How her small force had surrounded the heavily fortified base with only 300 soldiers against 3,000 rebels. How they had used psychological warfare to break the enemy's morale instead of their defenses. We started by cutting off their communications, Maya explained. Then we began playing recordings of their families back on Earth, begging them to surrender. We showed them videos of the atrocities Kane had committed on other worlds. We convinced them that they were fighting for a man who saw them as disposable tools. You attacked their minds instead of their bodies, Vextai observed. Exactly, Maya confirmed. We made them understand that they were on the wrong side of a war that couldn't be won. After 4 months, the entire garrison surrendered without firing a shot. Maya could see that this concept disturbed several council members. They understood physical violence, even if they found it distasteful. But the idea of deliberately manipulating an enemy's psychology seemed somehow worse to them. During the Outer Rim campaign, I was responsible for approximately 1,200 enemy deaths, Maya said. But more importantly, we ended a rebellion that could have cost hundreds of thousands of lives if it had been fought conventionally. And the civilians you trained? Grovewind asked. What became of them after the war? Most returned to their normal lives, Maya said. Some joined Earth's military as specialists in unconventional warfare. A few became advisors for other colonies facing similar problems. They had learned that ordinary people could defend themselves if they were willing to think creatively. Maya looked around the circle of alien faces. This is what you need to understand about human military doctrine. We don't fight fair because our enemies don't fight fair. We use whatever tactics are necessary to protect innocent people and end conflicts quickly. But how do you maintain moral boundaries when anything is permitted? Zaraneth asked. Everything is not permitted, Maya corrected. We have strict rules about protecting civilians, treating prisoners humanely, and avoiding unnecessary destruction. But within those boundaries, we adapt our methods to match the threat we're facing. She could see that the council members were struggling to understand this concept. Their species had evolved past the need for such flexibility. They had never faced enemies who forced them to choose between moral purity and practical necessity. The art of war, as humans practice it, is about finding the most effective solution to each unique problem, Maya explained. Sometimes that means conventional battles between military forces. Sometimes it means guerrilla warfare and sabotage. Sometimes it means psychological operations and propaganda. The method doesn't matter as much as the result. Feckmore rumbled thoughtfully. Your species treats warfare as a science rather than an art form. We treat warfare as a tool, Maya said simply. A terrible tool that we use only when all other options have failed. But when we must use it, we use it effectively. The chamber fell quiet as the council members considered her words. Maya could see that they were beginning to understand the philosophy behind human military doctrine, even if they found it disturbing. Humans fought to win, not to prove their courage or honor their ancestors. They fought to protect the weak and preserve the peace that others took for granted. Vextai looked down at the glowing tablet in front of him, its surface covered with streams of data that Maya couldn't read from her position. The other council members had similar devices, all displaying what she assumed were her complete military records. After her stories about the corporate wars, the Devourer conflict, and the Outer Rim rebellion, they wanted specific numbers. Captain Rodriguez, Vextai said slowly, we have attempted to analyze your service record mathematically. The scope of your involvement in violent conflict over 4 decades appears to be unprecedented in our experience. Maya nodded calmly. I've served in 17 major campaigns and participated in dozens of smaller operations. Each conflict required different skills and resulted in different casualty counts. Counselor Kethare, the telepathic being with gray skin, gestured at her device with one of her 4 arms. Our analysis suggests that you have been personally responsible for the deaths of more beings than entire armies from most Federation species. How is such a concentration of violence in one individual possible? Maya had expected this question. The Federation species fought small, limited conflicts when they fought at all. The idea of one person accumulating a lifetime record of violence was foreign to them. Council members, Maya said, human military careers often span several decades. We develop specialists who become very effective at their jobs. Over time, those specialists participate in many different conflicts, each adding to their total experience and effectiveness. She could see confusion on several faces. These species didn't understand the concept of professional soldiers who dedicated their entire lives to warfare. Let me break down the numbers for you, Maya said. It might help you understand how my record accumulated over time. Maya began with her early career. During my first 10 years of service, I was primarily a sniper and small unit leader. My confirmed kills during this period were mostly individual targets eliminated at long range. She explained how sniper warfare worked, how a single skilled marksman could influence an entire battle by eliminating key enemy personnel. The council members listened with obvious discomfort as she described the precision and patience required to kill from a distance. My highest single operation count during this period was the Mars Liberation, Maya said. I spent 6 months in the Martian desert, targeting enemy officers and specialists who were coordinating the occupation forces. How many? Feckmore asked bluntly. 847 confirmed kills, Maya replied. Each shot was carefully planned and executed to maximize the impact on enemy operations while minimizing the risk to our own forces. The number seemed to echo in the chamber. Maya could see several council members exchange glances, their alien features showing shock and disbelief. One individual eliminated nearly 1,000 beings in 6 months. Zaraneth asked, her tree-like form shifting with what Maya recognized as distress. One individual prevented thousands of civilian deaths by eliminating the people who were organizing mass executions and forced labor camps, Maya corrected. Every enemy officer I killed was someone who would have ordered the deaths of innocent Martian colonists. Maya continued with the middle period of her career, when she had moved into artillery and air support coordination. As I gained rank and experience, my role changed from direct combat to coordinating larger-scale operations. She explained how modern human warfare used technology to multiply the effectiveness of individual soldiers. How one person with the right equipment and training could call in orbital strikes, coordinate bomber runs, or direct automated weapons systems. During the Centauri campaign, I was responsible for artillery coordination across 3 battle zones, Maya said. My job was to identify enemy concentrations and direct our heavy weapons to eliminate them. And the casualties from these attacks? Vextai asked. Approximately 3,200 enemy personnel, Maya said matter-of-factly. But those strikes also prevented enemy forces from overrunning refugee camps containing over 100,000 civilians. Maya could see that the council members were struggling with the mathematics of her explanations. In their experience, violence was individual and limited. The idea that technology could allow one person to coordinate the deaths of thousands was beyond their understanding. The largest single operation I coordinated was the strike on the Blackwater bioweapons facility, Maya continued. Intelligence had confirmed that the enemy was developing a plague that would target human genetic markers specifically. She described the mission in detail. How they had confirmed that the facility contained enough weaponized virus to kill every human in 3 star systems. How a ground assault would have risked releasing the plague accidentally. How the only safe option was complete destruction from orbit. I authorized the orbital bombardment personally, Maya said. The facility was destroyed completely, along with 1,500 enemy personnel who were working on the project. You ordered the destruction of an entire facility? Grovewind asked, his bark-like skin changing colors rapidly. I prevented a genocide, Maya replied firmly. Those 1,500 people were working to create a weapon that would have killed billions of innocent humans. Their deaths saved countless lives. Maya moved on to the later period of her career, when she had reached command rank and was responsible for entire military operations. As a colonel and later as a general, my decisions affected thousands of soldiers and millions of civilians. She explained how command responsibility worked in human military structures. How senior officers made strategic decisions that determined the fate of entire campaigns. How the success or failure of military operations often depended on the judgment of a few key individuals. But the numbers we are seeing suggest direct responsibility for enemy deaths far beyond what command decisions would normally involve, Kethare observed. Maya nodded. That's because I never stopped participating in direct combat operations. Even as a general, I continued to lead critical missions personally when the situation required it. She described several operations where she had taken personal command of special forces units. Rescue missions to extract captured civilians from enemy territory. Assassination missions to eliminate enemy leaders who were committing war crimes. Sabotage operations to destroy weapons that threatened entire populations. The highest single-day count in my career was during the defense of Shepherd Colony, Maya said. Enemy forces were using human civilians as shields while they prepared to execute hostages on live broadcasts. Maya's voice grew quiet as she remembered that day. I led a strike team that neutralized the enemy command structure in 4 hours of close combat. We saved 1,200 hostages, but the operation required eliminating everyone who was holding them. How many? Thekmore asked. 437 enemy combatants, Maya said. All killed in direct combat while they were in the process of murdering innocent people. Maya looked around the circle of alien faces. Council members, I know these numbers seem impossible to you. Your species have never faced the kind of threats that forced humans to develop soldiers like me. But every death I caused was in service of protecting innocent life. But the psychological impact, Zaraneth said. How does a being cope with such extensive involvement in violence? How do you maintain sanity and moral clarity? Maya was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something that most humans didn't fully understand either. You carry it, she said finally. You remember why each death was necessary. You honor the people you saved by never forgetting the cost of saving them. Do you remember them all? Vextai asked quietly. I remember the important ones, Maya said. I remember the first person I killed, and the last one. I remember the deaths that prevented massacres and the ones that saved children. I don't remember every face, but I remember every choice. Maya could see that the council members were beginning to understand the human concept of a warrior's burden. The idea that some individuals accepted the psychological cost of violence so that others could live in peace. The final count, as of my last active mission, was 10,347 confirmed enemy deaths directly attributable to my actions, Maya said. But those deaths protected millions of innocent people over the course of 4 decades of service. The chamber fell silent as the council members absorbed this information. Maya could see various emotions on their faces: horror, admiration, confusion, and something that might have been respect. And now you ask us to trust your species with membership in our peaceful federation, Grovewind said finally. We ask you to trust us to protect your peaceful federation, Maya corrected. Because someday, you may face an enemy that cannot be reasoned with or reformed. When that day comes, you'll need someone who understands the mathematics of necessary violence. The silence in the chamber stretched on for several minutes as the council members processed Maya's testimony. She could see them struggling to reconcile the enormity of her kill count with her calm, professional demeanor. To these peaceful beings, she should have been either a monster consumed by bloodlust or a broken individual destroyed by trauma. Instead, she sat before them as a composed military officer who spoke of death and duty with equal measure. Vextai finally broke the silence. General Rodriguez, he said, and Maya noticed that he had used her final rank rather than her earlier title of captain. We have heard your accounts of various conflicts and operations. But we find ourselves struggling to understand the human psychology that makes such a career possible. Maya tilted her head slightly. What specifically would you like to understand, counselor? How does a being carry the weight of so many deaths? Zaraneth asked, her tree-like features shifting with what Maya recognized as genuine curiosity rather than judgment. In our society, if one individual were responsible for even a single death, they would require extensive healing and support from the entire community. Maya considered the question carefully. It was one that human military psychologists had been studying for centuries, and one that she had wrestled with personally throughout her career. Council members, Maya began, humans who choose military careers understand that we will carry burdens that civilians cannot share. We accept this responsibility because someone must. The alternative is allowing innocent people to suffer when we could prevent it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But you're right that it takes a toll. Every human soldier deals with what we call the weight of command differently. Maya began to describe the human systems for supporting military personnel through the psychological challenges of warfare. How soldiers were trained to process trauma and maintain operational effectiveness. How military units became extended families that shared the burden of difficult choices. The most important thing to understand is that we don't carry this weight alone, Maya said. Throughout my career, I've been part of military units where everyone understood the costs and consequences of our actions. She talked about the bonds between soldiers who had shared combat experience. How they supported each other through the difficult moments when the weight of their choices threatened to overwhelm them. How they honored their fallen comrades by continuing to serve the cause they had died for. Let me tell you about Staff Sergeant Amy Chen, Maya said, her voice taking on a softer tone. She served under my command during the New Tokyo evacuation, 15 years ago. Maya described the evacuation in detail. How enemy forces had surrounded the city and were systematically executing civilians. How her unit had been tasked with holding key transportation hubs while refugees escaped. How they had been outnumbered 5-1 with no hope of reinforcement. Amy was responsible for defending the central school complex, Maya said. 3,000 children and elderly civilians were sheltering there while we organized transport off-planet. When enemy forces broke through our outer perimeter, Amy's position was the last thing standing between them and those civilians. Maya's voice grew quiet as she remembered. Amy held that position for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. She used every weapon available, called in artillery strikes on her own position, and fought hand-to-hand when her ammunition ran out. When we finally retook the school, we found her body surrounded by 47 enemy soldiers. The council members listened in respectful silence as Maya continued. Amy saved 3,000 innocent lives that day. She died doing what she believed was right, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Her sacrifice meant that children went home to their families instead of dying in a war zone. How do you honor such sacrifice? Grovewind asked quietly. By remembering why she died, Maya said simply. By continuing to serve the cause she gave her life for. By ensuring that her sacrifice meant something. Maya talked about other soldiers who had served under her command over the years. Private Marcus Williams, who had held a defensive position alone for 12 hours during the frontier wars, allowing an entire medical convoy to escape enemy territory. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, who had piloted a damaged transport through enemy fire to evacuate wounded civilians, dying when her ship finally gave out just after the last passenger was safely aboard. Each of these soldiers made a choice, Maya explained. They could have saved themselves by abandoning their posts or their missions. Instead, they chose to sacrifice their own lives to protect others. As their commanding officer, I carry the responsibility of making sure their deaths accomplished something meaningful. Counselor Thekmore leaned forward, his warrior's instincts engaged by the discussion of military honor. But how do you make such choices yourself? How do you decide when to order soldiers into situations where they will likely die? Maya was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something that most humans, let alone aliens, struggled to understand. Command decisions are about mathematics and morality combined, she said finally. You calculate the likely costs and benefits of each option, but you also consider your obligation to protect innocent life. She described specific command decisions she had made throughout her career. How she had ordered artillery strikes on positions where her own soldiers were trapped, because allowing the enemy to escape would have cost more lives in the long run. How she had sent small teams on suicide missions to destroy enemy weapons that threatened entire populations. The hardest decision I ever made was during the siege of Liberty Station, Maya said. Enemy forces had captured a transport ship carrying 500 civilian refugees. They were demanding that we surrender our entire fleet in exchange for the hostages. Maya described the situation in detail. How the enemy had positioned the transport ship where any rescue attempt would likely result in massive civilian casualties. How intelligence suggested that the enemy planned to execute the hostages regardless of whether their demands were met. I had to choose between accepting the enemy's terms and hoping they would honor the agreement, or authorizing a rescue mission that would probably result in significant civilian deaths, Maya said. Either choice meant people would die because of my decision. What did you choose? Vextai asked. I authorized the rescue mission, Maya said. We lost 63 hostages during the operation, but we saved 437 lives. More importantly, we prevented the enemy from using the same tactic against other civilian populations. Maya could see pain in her own voice reflected in the expressions of several council members. They were beginning to understand that command meant accepting responsibility for terrible choices with no perfect solutions. The weight of command isn't just about the enemies you kill, Maya explained. It's about the soldiers you send into danger and the civilians you can't save. It's about making decisions where any choice results in death, and living with the consequences of those choices. She talked about the letters she had written to the families of fallen soldiers. How she had personally delivered death notifications to spouses and parents and children. How she had attended funerals and memorial services for people who had died because of orders she had given. But you also carry the weight of the lives you save, Maya continued. Every successful mission, every civilian evacuation, every enemy threat eliminated before it could harm innocent people. The soldiers who died under my command saved millions of lives over the course of my career. Maya looked around the circle of alien faces. The burden is shared among all humans who serve in the military. We understand that freedom and peace require constant vigilance, and that vigilance sometimes requires sacrifice. We accept this burden so that others don't have to. How do you maintain hope? Zaraneth asked. How do you continue to believe in the value of life when you have seen so much death? Maya smiled sadly. Because I've also seen so much life preserved. I've seen children grow up free because someone was willing to fight for their freedom. I've seen colonies prosper because someone protected them from those who would enslave them. I've seen peace maintained because someone was willing to pay the price of that peace. She paused, thinking of all the worlds she had helped protect over her career. The weight of command is heavy, but it's balanced by the knowledge that your choices matter. That the people you protect go on to live full lives, raise families, create art, explore the universe. Their freedom justifies the burden we carry. The chamber was quiet as the council members considered her words. Maya could see that they were beginning to understand not just the mathematics of human warfare, but the moral framework that made it psychologically sustainable for the individuals who carried it out. We serve so others don't have to, Maya said finally. We carry the weight of necessary violence so that peaceful beings like yourselves can focus on building better worlds. That's not a burden to us. It's a privilege. Vextai looked down at his glowing tablet one final time, then set it aside with what Maya recognized as a gesture of conclusion among his species. The other council members did the same, their various devices dimming as they prepared for the final phase of the tribunal. General Rodriguez, Vextai said formally, this council must now deliberate on what we have learned about humanity and your personal testimony regarding human military doctrine. We will recess for 1 standard hour before reconvening for our final questions and decision. Maya nodded and stood as the council members filed out of the chamber through various exits suited to their different physiologies. She was escorted to a small waiting room where she sat alone with her thoughts, wondering if she had done enough to convince them that humanity belonged in the Federation. When the session reconvened, Maya could see that the hour of deliberation had not been easy for the council members. Several looked troubled, while others appeared to have reached some form of resolution. The dynamics between species seemed to have shifted during their private discussions. Vextai called the session to order with a formal gesture. General Rodriguez, the council has discussed your testimony at length. We have also reviewed additional records and consulted with our respective governments about the implications of human membership in the Federation. Maya waited quietly, knowing that interrupting now would be a serious diplomatic error. We find ourselves facing a dilemma that none of our species anticipated when this tribunal was convened, Vextai continued. Your testimony has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of peace and the cost of maintaining it. Counselor Rex Dan, representing the warrior caste that Maya had not heard from before, stood to speak. His species was known for their concepts of honor in battle, though their conflicts were ritualized and limited compared to human warfare. General Rodriguez, Rex Dan said in a voice that carried the authority of ancient military tradition, my people understand combat and the burden of those who fight. We have listened to your accounts with the respect due to a fellow warrior. He paused, looking around at his fellow council members. What we have learned disturbs some of our colleagues, but it illuminates a truth that we cannot ignore. Your species fights not for conquest or glory, but for protection of the innocent. Every conflict you described was defensive in nature. Maya felt a flicker of hope, but kept her expression neutral. Counselor Zaraneth spoke up from her position in the circle. General Rodriguez, I must be honest with you. Your testimony has horrified my people. The scale of violence you describe as routine is beyond our comprehension. Maya's heart sank slightly, but Zaraneth continued. However, the tree-like being said slowly, we have also come to understand something important. The violence you describe was not random or cruel. It was surgical and necessary. You fought monsters so that innocents could remain innocent. Thekmor rumbled his agreement. The question before us is not whether humans are violent. Clearly, you are. The question is whether that violence serves a greater purpose that benefits all peaceful species. Maya could see that the council was genuinely divided on this issue. Some species found human military capabilities too frightening to accept, while others were beginning to see the potential value of having guardians who could protect the Federation from threats they couldn't handle themselves. Grovewind spoke next, his bark-like features shifting colors as he considered his words. General Rodriguez, we have been debating a fundamental question during our recess. Do peaceful species have the right to remain peaceful if that peace depends on others being willing to commit violence on their behalf? It was a profound philosophical question that went to the heart of galactic civilization. Maya chose her words carefully. Counselor Grovewind, she said, I believe that peaceful species have not just the right but the obligation to remain peaceful whenever possible. Violence should always be the last resort, used only when all other options have failed. She paused, looking around the circle. But I also believe that peaceful species have an obligation to acknowledge and support those who are willing to use violence to protect them. Denying the necessity of guardians doesn't eliminate threats. It just makes you defenseless against them. Vextai leaned forward. General Rodriguez, we have one final question before we render our decision. It may be the most important question of this entire tribunal. Maya straightened in her chair. I'm ready, Counselor. Do you regret your actions over the course of your military career? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maya knew that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but the future relationship between humanity and the galactic community. She took a deep breath and considered everything she had experienced over 4 decades of service. The friends she had lost. The enemies she had killed. The civilians she had saved. The choices that had kept her awake at night and the successes that had made it all worthwhile. Counselor Vextai, Maya said slowly, I regret the necessity of violence. I regret that we live in a universe where sometimes killing is the only way to prevent greater loss of life. I regret every soldier who died under my command and every enemy I had to eliminate. She paused, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. But I do not regret standing between predators and their prey. I do not regret ensuring that children could grow up free instead of enslaved or dead. I do not regret protecting the weak from those who would exploit them. Maya's voice grew stronger as she continued. If my willingness to use violence to protect innocent life makes humanity too dangerous for your Federation, then perhaps your Federation is not worthy of the peace it claims to value. The chamber fell silent. Maya could see various emotions playing across the alien faces around her. Some looked shocked by her boldness. Others seemed impressed by her conviction. Vextai stood slowly. The Council will now vote on humanity's application for Federation membership. The voting process was formal and ceremonial, with each Council member stating their decision and reasoning for the record. Maya listened as the votes were tallied, feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders. When the count was finished, Vextai announced the result. By a vote of 7 in favor and 5 opposed, humanity is granted provisional membership in the Galactic Federation. Maya felt a rush of relief and pride, but Vextai wasn't finished. This membership comes with specific conditions, he continued. Human military doctrine will be studied and shared with Federation species facing existential threats. Humanity will serve as the Federation's primary military response force for conflicts that cannot be resolved through peaceful means. Maya nodded her acceptance of these terms. As the formal session concluded and the council members began to file out, Councillor Zaraneth approached Maya directly. The peaceful being looked troubled but thoughtful. General Rodriguez, Zaraneth said quietly, your species terrifies us. But I have come to understand that perhaps the galaxy needs someone willing to be terrible when terrible things threaten the innocent. Maya nodded solemnly. Counselor, I hope you never have to discover how right you are. 3 years later, Maya's words proved prophetic. When the Void Hunters emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies, consuming entire star systems as they advanced toward the galactic core, it was human fleets that responded first. Admiral Maya Rodriguez, now leading the combined Federation Defense Forces, found herself facing her greatest challenge yet. The Void Hunters made the Devourer swarm look like a minor pest by comparison. They were ancient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in their consumption of galactic civilization. The peaceful species of the Federation finally understood what Maya had tried to tell them. Sometimes peace could only be preserved by those willing to pay the price in blood. Humanity didn't wage war because they loved violence. They waged war so others didn't have to. In the end, Maya's kill count became irrelevant. What mattered was how many lives she had saved, how many worlds she had protected, and how many peaceful species could continue to pursue their enlightened civilizations because someone else was willing to stand guard in the darkness. The final battle against the Void Hunters was won at enormous cost, but it was won. And in the aftermath, as the galaxy began to rebuild, Maya received a message from the Federation Council. It was from Councillor Zaraneth, and it contained only one line, "Thank you for being what we could not be." Maya smiled as she read it, thinking of all the soldiers who had served under her command over the years. All the young people who had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect others. All the terrible choices that had led to this moment of peace. She had stopped counting her kills at 10,000, but she had never stopped counting the lives saved. And in the end, that was the only number that really mattered. The price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and sometimes that vigilance had to be measured in lives taken rather than lives lived. But someone had to be willing to pay that price, and Maya Rodriguez had never regretted being that someone. The galaxy was safe because humanity existed to guard it. And humanity was proud to serve as the shield that protected those who had evolved beyond the need for shields themselves.